who's dead. Oh yeah, my name is Ryan. None of that means much right now, but later you'll understand. As a child, I had loving parents, a swing set, and my best dog, Petey. I should have been truly happy. The only problem was what was in our basement. My family owned a funeral home. The funeral home was 4 miles down the road. It was a beautiful building, very soothing to help people deal with their recent loss. However, it wasn't very big and it didn't have a basement. For that reason, the basement at our house was where my dad prepared the recently deceased for their showing. In a nutshell, we always had dead people in our basement. My dad tried to make it a little less creepy by saying, "Son, don't think of them as dead. Think of them as sleeping." These are good people who need our help with the last stage of their lives. Pretty sound advice, don't you think? With that in mind, I was able to move about and help my dad. In retrospect, I had seen things no 12-year-old should ever see. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Phillips, was an old widow who always watched me when I was outside. She hated Petey the most, always making mean comments and dirty looks toward him. Mom said, "Ignore her, son. She'll get hers one day." So that's what I did. One Saturday, Petey got stuck in the fence between our properties. He screeched in pain. As I ran to him, I could see Mrs. Phillips smiling. Soon she began to laugh. My rage boiled over as I yelled, "Don't worry, you'll get yours one day." Her laughter turned to a sadistic smile. Then she winked at me and went in the house. Dad looked Petey over and said he only had a scrape on his leg and that he'd be fine. I wondered what kind of cold, heartless person could have laughed at that, and don't get me going on that creepy smile followed by a wink. I decided there were happier things to think about and put it behind me. Over the next 4 years, I worked as hard as I could for my father's attention. He was a very closed man. I knew he loved me, but he had a hard time showing it. I constantly did odd jobs around the house to help free up his time. Unfortunately, he filled his free time with more work. He had his heart set on a large building in town. Once converted to a funeral home, he said he could accommodate up to 4 funerals at once and could perform pre-showing preparations there instead of our basement. Now that part I was very in favor of. The summer I turned 15, Dad really started grooming me for the family business. I didn't care for it, but it did allow Dad and I to become closer. I welcomed his new laughter and many stories I never heard as a child. It was mid-June. Dad and I had been working in the basement all day, and we finally finished up. I showered and went right to bed. That night, I awoke to a lot of noise and flashing lights outside. I put the pillow over my head and went to sleep thinking it was a dream. The next morning, Mom said there was a horrible accident next door. Mrs. Phillips had fallen down the basement stairs and died from the fall. After police reports were completed and it was ruled an accident, Mrs. Phillips was sent to us. Dad asked if this bothered me. It did, but I knew what he wanted to hear. "No, she just needs our help," I said. "That's my boy," Dad said with delight. Although I was older, I still hated that miserable old lady. Since my comment that day, She said I had threatened her life and I need to be put in jail. Whatever I did something that she didn't like, she was quick to remind me of it. I watched as he began the proceedings. As he was draining her body of fluids, I could see the hospital gown covering her slowly sink closer and closer to the large stainless steel embalming table like she was being deflated. The phone rang. He had been on the phone for a while as I stared at Mrs. Phillips, this heartless woman who I'd grown to hate. Suddenly, with no warning, she sat up. I screamed. Dad told the person on the phone to hold on. Easy, son. It's just rigor mortis. Remember what I told you. Now help Mrs. Phillips lay back down. He turned and went back to the phone. I couldn't disappoint him, so I placed a hand on her leg and the other on her shoulder. She felt cold and deflated, like her skin would tear if I squeezed too tight. Holding my hands open and flat with a considerable amount of pressure, I forced her back down while saying, "It's okay, Mrs. Phillips. I'm just gonna lay you back down." Once she was lying flat again, I said, "Now, isn't that more comfortable?" Dad turned and gave me a big smile, then turned back to his call. Just then, I looked at Mrs. Phillips' face. Her eyes were open. I could see her wrinkled skin starting to sag because her fluids were almost gone. Just then, she smiled. That same sadistical smile she gave when Petey was in pain. I completely froze. Then she winked the same way she did that day. Slowly, her arm began to rise toward my face. I turned and ran away as fast as I could. I never went down in that basement again. I buried myself in computers to avoid human contact. I swore I'd never go near another dead person. The image still haunts my sleep. 22 years later, and I still awake drenched in sweat, heart pounding from that horrible day, and each time the smell of death fills my senses as I scramble to turn on the light. They say we all have our demons. Mrs. Phillips